Next up, we have our panel on ICS threat intelligence sharing. It is going to be moderated by Bo Woods, joined by Katie Nichols, Maggie Morganti, and Jeff Jones. And I think I saw everybody on here, so we're just gonna, there we go. Katie, rocking the red canary. Maggie, Jeff, you're blurry. There we go. All right, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Bryson. And thank you all for attending the third edition of the Hack the Capitol conference. It's a little bit different than the past couple, understandably, but I think the quality of the folks here is no lesser. And speaking of which, I've got three amazing panelists here to talk today about ICS threat intelligence sharing and information sharing. We're gonna give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves in just a minute. Then we're gonna have an open session where we just chat amongst ourselves, all friends, and kind of banter a little bit. And then with about 15 minutes left, we will give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. Easy questions, hard questions, I'll let you be the judge of that. But if you go into the lower left-hand corner of your screen, I think it is, you can enter questions into chat, whichever is the left on your screen. I can't tell with if the display is mirrored or not. But drop down there and enter some questions in chat for the panelists. Before I get to their introductions, I want to give a few framing remarks that came out of really the conversation we had setting up this panel. And I want to recognize, first of all, that ICS, industrial control systems, and the engineering side of the house has done a lot over the past 50, 70 years, as long as it's been a discipline and a domain, to really go towards a safety culture, safety first culture. And they've done an amazing job at keeping things safe. Information technology and cybersecurity, which is a different domain with much less of a storied history, has also come in, and now everything kind of runs on an IT infrastructure. And as such, the domains of concern are very heavily overlapped, even if the experience and the lineage of these two groups is very different. And I think one of the common things that we tend to hear in these types of conversations are, those are two groups that need to come together more. And hopefully this conversation can help them come together more. I also want to recognize that there's many different types of organizations that have industrial control systems. It's not just electrical utilities or power, water, and gas. It's manufacturing. It's hospitals have ICS. The proliferation of industrial control systems, especially computerized industrial control systems, is such that most organizations now have some link to industrial control systems. But there's a huge variety in the capabilities that they have to execute on any kind of information that they're given. So there are some organizations for which they have the capability and they do it really well to take information coming in all the streams, to digest it, process it, and then act on it. There are other organizations that don't have those capabilities. I've worked with companies where the OT security person was one person in a company of 150 or so employees, and I've worked with organizations that have 5 or 10 threat analysts just looking at OT threats. And those companies, those organizations are going to be hugely different in their ability to act because their security postures, their ability to do anything with their IT infrastructure is going to be vastly different. So I think we need to examine different types of information sharing for those different types of groups. And finally, just like the defenders have a wide variety of motivations and capabilities, so do adversaries. And so while a host of adversaries exist, many hundreds or maybe thousands of groups exist around the world, a lot of information sharing, and especially threat information sharing, tends to consolidate around a small group of advanced persistent threats, even though many other types of groups or capabilities could cause harm to industrial control systems. So in talking about the panel discussion, we thought that those were three kind of priming or framing ideas that we wanted to get across early on to kind of help set up some of the rest of the conversation. And now I want to turn it over to the panelists, and I'll have them introduce themselves. And because I watched a talk earlier today where they talked about superheroes, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to say which superhero they most identify with and why. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to jump on that one first. Otherwise, I'll assign out a volunteer.
I mean, Jeff has Superman in his background, so I vote Jeff.
That's a great point, Jeff.
That was not intentional, and I think for some reason I like Batman better, but this was apparently as a child I was not seen anywhere without that thing on. So as a gift a few years ago, my mother found it in her attic and framed it for me. So I think I identify most with Superman. That's who I wanted to be apparently as a child.
And why do you identify with Superman?
Back then, I don't know why I did. I think I just wanted to fly. As any kid would, right?
Yeah. All right. Who's next, Katie or Maggie?
I think she's pointing to me, whichever direction I'm in. I'm going to go with a super villain. I know you said superhero, but I'm going to go with Poison Ivy. Because it's also a malware name and a terrible plant. The other day, my friend was like, I hate Poison Ivy. And I was like, which one do you mean? So I'm going to keep it on the cyber theme and go with Poison Ivy as a villain.
I like it.
How's that? There you go, Maggie.
Perfect.
I bought you a few seconds, and now Maggie's going to have the best answer because she gets to go last.
So that's so on brand that Katie wants to be both a villain and a malware. I think that's fantastic. No, I actually wasn't like big into superheroes growing up, so I feel like I would be being disingenuous to say that I have one that I kind of personally identify with. But I do a lot of kind of POC red team stuff, so I can get on board with Katie's idea of identifying with a villain.
Okay, I like it. Well, so switching themes a little bit, but kind of in the same vein. You all work in a difficult field, a difficult profession, dealing with difficult topics that usually pop up, on a Friday afternoon, on a long holiday weekend, after you've kind of mentally checked out for the week and everybody else is talking about their vacation plans. That's not easy. What motivates you to do what you do at the level you do it? What keeps you going? Maggie, I'll pick on you first since you went last on the last question.
No, that works. I always joke that I was kind of raised by a clan of feral engineers. My dad worked in manufacturing and then oil and gas. Cousins are maritime, aviation, medical, grid, nuclear. I kind of have the whole spectrum at ICS at my Thanksgiving dinner tables, and seeing how what I do affects what everyone else in my family does, and what they sometimes aren't really willing to drink my Kool-Aid on. Is really kind of what keeps me motivated to keep coming back and doing my job at 7 p.m., 8 p.m. on Friday.
Yeah, Jeff, what about you?
I started my career in IT really, and accidentally fell into the energy industry. Just in an IT job, and the more I worked in that environment, the more fascinated I got with it. And then how I fell into ICS was I was working at one of the nation's largest electricity providers, and there was an opportunity to go find a piece of equipment. Like, it involved crawling on the floor in a dirty power plant and pulling on cables, and it just sounded, I'd never seen a coal plant or any kind of power plant up close before. So I was like, that sounds like fun. And so I volunteered, and just seeing that operation up close, I actually got to see some coal going up the conveyor belt and getting crushed. And one of the engineers took me all through the plant. My jaw was on the ground. I've always been somebody that was fascinated with moving parts and gears and neat stuff like that. So it was just a happy accident. And then since then, I just immersed myself into trying to learn more about these systems and the problems with the systems and security of them. And then moving to the ISAC was a chance for me to, it just became a passion of mine because of the scope of the problem. And I felt that I had an opportunity to, in some small way, contribute to the amazing people that are working every day to, make their systems more resilient and share information, just, contribute to the industry. And it's just become a passion. It's just what I do, and it's what I will do. I just love it.
That's the problem with being last, is what everyone else said. I mean, what motivates me is ultimately the people in this industry and the strong belief that we are all making a difference by sharing, by making these connections. By way of introductions, it's funny to hear Jeff say he kind of fell into this, because I did too over a decade ago, wanted to do journalism. We had journalists on our last panel, and then kind of fell into this and been doing cyber threat intel and defense for over a decade now, now as the Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. And it's been such a pleasure. I primarily look at the IT side. So going back to kind of what you were saying at the beginning of the panel, Bo, that we think of ICS as this big thing. And my visibility in that is much more in the informational technology side, the IT side, Windows or Mac endpoints. But Maggie and Jeff, who are more on the ICS side, can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how a lot of threats come in, if I'm not mistaken. So that's kind of the visibility I bring, as well as I love threat intel. I teach that class for SANS. So I love this idea that the intelligence matters, and intelligence to me, much more, as you said, Bo, than just, sharing bad IPs or email addresses. It's all about actionable information to help make better decisions, try to get these adversaries out. So a lot we can dig into there, but that's a little bit about me and my origin story on that superhero theme, perhaps.
Well played. Katie, actually, something I want to follow up with you on is, you said you've got an interest and background in journalism. How does that play into your ability to work in a highly technical field and to excel at it?
Yeah, I am such a firm believer in a good liberal arts education. I will, go on the soapbox for a while. I went to a liberal arts school, Smith College, thus the Pearls in Massachusetts. But I believe that good analysts, intelligence analysts or defenders, we all have to be analysts. And the ability to think and write and analyze, you don't need to have a computer science degree to do that. And so, I wanted to go into journalism. I interned at CNN. All of those skills really translate well to being a cyber threat intel analyst. And we have so many examples of this. Our friend Selena Larson, the whole last panel, like I would any day grab Kim or Sean and be like, hey, you all want to be a threat intel analyst? Because you could totally do it. So I think the ability to think and piece together information and write and communicate, intel analysts have to do all of those things.
Yeah. And I wonder how on the ICS side, translation is a big deal, right? Going from IT and cybersecurity lingo to ICS lingo. What are some stories you have to share, or what are some thoughts on, like, just how to effectively do that in an organization where those two disciplines might be siloed? Engineering might sit on the plant side, and the cybersecurity team might sit back in the the Crystal Palace or the Ivory Tower, or whatever they happen to call their the place where the executives sit. How do you make that bridge between those two groups that are often disparate?
I'll take that one. I had that's a huge challenge, and I still, in all the years that I've been doing this, I'm still hearing it from from an EISAC perspective. Some of our members are the asset owners and operators of the grid. I get that question a lot, and how I had traction at my old company was just time spent, creating relationships and sharing information with the system owners and the folks that were responsible for the system, just to get their trust and get them to understand, that cybersecurity of these systems contributed to a safer system, contributing to a more resilient system. And, I really piggybacked on the culture there, in any of these industrial environments, whether it's an electric company or, wherever, equipment can hurt or kill people. Safety is the culture of life there. Many companies like that, they start every meeting, whether it's virtual or on the phone or or in person with a safety message. Every meeting kicked off with a safety message. So I started seeing, looking for opportunities that I could piggyback on those and insert a cybersecurity message there that was relevant, to that environment or to that system. And you start, to gain some trust over coffee and donuts and pizza at lunch, and maybe sometimes some beverages after work or something, to get each other to really understand that we're all trying to contribute to the resiliency and the safety of these environments. And then certainly one of the biggest things is these engineers and folks that are responsible for the uptime of these things are just incredibly intelligent people. To learn from them and hear what they have to say and what's important to them, and help that translate to my own work, was just so enlightening. And I mean, it took years, because you typically, the folks in the ivory tower are the ones that are saying no to everything that they're asking for, no to every piece of software they want to install, whatever. And it's tremendously annoying to them, as it should be. But trying to find that balance and the understanding of each other's priorities was where we started to get some traction. And there's folks, even from that company I still talk to all the time, that I'm great friends with, and it just comes with time and trust.
Yeah. If I can add to that, I also think it's really important to not make the hill seem unclimbable. I know that, when we approach this problem as cybersecurity professionals, our main thrust to this is securing your organization. And I think it's really important that we approach this with a deep understanding that that organization being secure isn't their main priority at all. Their main priority is make money. At the end of the day, like, if they're not profitable, they can be secure all day long. No one's happy, no one's getting paid. So I think really just, especially in ICS, understanding, first off, who you need to talk to about what. So the engineer isn't the guy that you probably need to talk to about implementing a certain security control. You may get him on board, but that's not in his wheelhouse to make that decision, to write that check, to sign off on that funding. So, understanding that, we definitely need to get buy-in from the engineers and have them see us as legitimate players in this game. I think sometimes we bombard them, and they encounter, kind of more strictly IT professionals who, I had a professor in college who said, I don't get what the big deal is with ICS. Why can't you just patch it all? And, any of us, and this guy had a PhD in computer science, and, any of us who've spent time here know that that's not viable. So, I feel like some engineers have been a little bit jaded by people like that. And then I think also we need to kind of make peace with how, threat intel is going to be used sometimes. I, like Katie, have a liberal arts background, and then went and got my master's in Intel. And I had a professor that just beat it into us that, Intel leads ops. That's what it does. But I think we need to make peace that our Intel that we produce might not always be used by the defenders. Sometimes it legitimately is just going to be used by those people trying to convince the people in the ivory tower to say, hey, we've been telling you that we want this, here's this fancy Intel report that says this is a danger, and, Dragos or FireEye or CrowdStrike or any of the really good, MITRE, anyone who puts this stuff out, it might only be used to legitimize signing a check for security control. And I think that we need to embrace that as a win as security professionals, and not get too kind of stuck in our ideal view of how all of this works if it were up to us.
I love that so much, Maggie. I'll jump in real here. I mean, intelligence, and I preach this so much, it's all about listening to your consumers. And so exactly what you said, Maggie, of sometimes the Intel teams, and I've seen this on the IT and the OT or ICS side, we write this report and we're like, well, our operators, our defenders should use these analytics and these behaviors to identify the adversaries on your networks. But then, yeah, it's used to justify, hey, we need an IDS or we need some kind of security appliance. And that's great too, because as I said earlier, and you're saying as well, Maggie, like, intelligence is supposed to help people take action. And maybe it's not the action we would want, but if it helps them solve a problem or address some need, we as Intel analysts have done our job, honestly.
Yeah, I was going to ask, it seems like there's a cycle there, right? It's not just Intel leads the way or Intel leads ops. but ops also feeds intel, right? Because if you don't know what your operations are doing, you'll get some exotic intel out, and they're like, well, this doesn't really. So like, how tight is that loop between ops and intel when you're working on the inside of an organization?
I'm going to give you my favorite Intel analyst answer. It depends. So ideally, I think some of the best intelligence-led organizations, and I could turn around, there's a book by my friends Rebecca Brown and Scott Roberts, Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. Like I've seen, especially more mature threat intelligence teams, like everything they do in terms of operations is driven by this knowledge of what adversaries and threats are doing, which of course I'm biased. I think that's the way it should be. But I've seen other organizations where it's so siloed, which just makes me sad because the Intel analysts have a lot that, you know, they could provide to ops. So I think you have to be really intentional as you're even setting up Intel teams. You know, where is that Intel team co-located? Are they right next to the operators? And, you know, I'd be interested in Maggie's and Jeff perspectives from like an ICS organization perspective. How do you even decide where a threat intel team sits or who does that sharing?
Yeah, it's tough because, you know, each environment is unique. Different system owners have different, you know, appetite for risk, and the people that, just like Maggie just said earlier, you know, the system engineer or the person responsible for the uptime of the system may not be the person with the checkbook, and their appetite for risk is completely different than maybe corporate securities or, you know, somebody else, just depending on how the organization is. So it's a huge challenge, and you know, there's even, you know, folks that I've talked to where, you know, each campus has different requirements for the way they operate, and trying to ascertain that, you know, from a corporate level, if you're, you know, a SOC of a large organization, is a huge challenge. And, you know, Maggie alluded earlier about, you know, kind of like making the hill not insurmountable. I think, you know, prioritizing based on, you know, things that you can maybe identify as the smaller wins, and whether you're using something like a, you know, a C2M2 type of exercise as a walkthrough to just look at, you know, how close you are to some sort of security before you even get into the maturity part of it.
C2M2? Jeff, what's C2M2?
You're about
Oh,
to
the
learn something
cybersecurity
exciting.
capability maturity model. It's, you know, if somebody wants to speak more in depth on that, please do. But, you know, it's a way for you to kind of measure yourselves against, you know, not only take a picture of kind of where we are now, but where do we want to be, and you can prioritize your efforts and resources there. And there's all kinds of ways, but, you know, I think Maggie really hit on something there. When the hill is just insurmountable, you just sit and go, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, no, C2M2 I think is actually a really good thing to bring up here. It's a resource that was developed by some of our colleagues actually that work at SAMS now. I don't know, Katie, you know, JD Christopher. He teaches, yeah. So he helped develop that, and essentially organizations can use it to score themselves based on different categories in cybersecurity, and it allows them to kind of get a baseline picture of, okay, this is where we're at with this, and then it'll give them, you know, kind of steps for, you know, 6 months, 1 year, where do we want to go, and also how do we get there, which I think is really, really important. And I think that, you know, sitting down and, you know, maybe not doing that exact exercise, but, you know, kind of an organic walkthrough like that is super, super important when you're trying to partner with any company, no matter how large it is. You know, some of these big guys like Siemens and Rockwell and Schneider, you know, probably have some pretty advanced, you know, network maturity when it comes to their security posture. But then you get into, you know, secondary manufacturing facilities, and they look at you like you have just sprouted 3 heads when you tell them that their historian can't be connected to their IT. It's like a data aggregator that can sometimes, a lot of times, if it's not done right, act as, you know, kind of a unintentional freeway right between your IT and your OT networks. And, you know, being able to go like, okay, this is the organization that I'm working with, so I can meet them where they're at. And I think that that's kind of my big passion point with ICS is we have such diversity of where people are at right now for, industrial everything as far as security. So I think that it's super important as analysts. I've worked as a security analyst for FireEye, and now a researcher at the lab. So we have industry partners there as well. And really just being able to sit with those people and, talk to them about this in a way that makes sense. Because, going down a rabbit hole on, reverse engineering malware with someone who hasn't even grasped segmenting a network is just going to make them just check out. I mean, they're going to be gone before you get 10 minutes into the conversation.
One of the nice things about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
So one of the nice things about a model like that too, and again, you can make your own. You can take pieces out of it that maybe work for you if you are just starting from nothing. Because the frameworks, as great as they are, there are things from NIST or the there's so many controls, and again, it can just seem like we're never going to get to this. And what was nice about some of the work I did with the C2M2 was, I think it's a digestible number of areas of focus. And one thing that was just kind of a heads up, if folks do explore that, there's kind of a scoring system, and we really needed to be careful in the delivery of that, because there are a lot of companies' environments are going to have zero. They're going to have no maturity. And if you deliver that to somebody that's responsible, it's almost kind of like, you just failed, that's terrible. And it's not. It's a matter of, based on these agreed upon, and again, you don't need to use all of them to get started. Maybe you just pick one area of focus and say, okay, based on some of these, standards that we're going to try to align with, we just don't have any maturity here in this. Let's try to look at moving towards a level 1. Or 5 of them. Let's try to get these 5, get towards level 1. Maybe we have scored a 2 here and we'd like to get to a 3. But when you have a 0, it's not a, well, you've just failed and not doing your job. It's, here's a path to some level of better than we were. And that really needs to be articulated, because you can unintentionally burn people when you're trying to do assessments and help with things, and that was not your intention at all.
This is awesome. So first off, thank you. This is a great example of why traditional IT people like me need to talk to ICS people, because I didn't know this existed. So now I have this 76-page PDF to read. And I love the idea of the maturity models. And one point on that, on controls and all these frameworks and models, because I previously worked on MITRE ATT&CK, and I know my former colleagues Marie and Otis talked about ICS attack earlier. I think that any kind of framework like this, whether it's a maturity model or something like ATT&CK, is incredibly helpful. And the role that intelligence and threat intelligence has there, I think, can be to help you prioritize. I've heard that all the time with ATT&CK or any other framework, or the CIS controls, something like that. Where do I focus first? And I think threat intelligence, hey, here's what the threats are doing that we know about. Whether it's, as Bo said, advanced persistent threats, which do exist, but they're not everything, or run-of-the-mill crimeware that some people might not look at, but that might be the biggest threat to an organization. So I think that it's awesome to have these models. And C2M2, I appreciate it. I'm going to read up on that one and see if we have any lessons for the IT side from it.
Yeah, I think most of this, the panel is on information sharing, and I think it's titled Threat Information Sharing or Threat Intelligence Sharing. But we've been talking a lot about defense, which I love, because I think there's this bridge taking the threat intelligence, which may come in sticks and taxi, or it may come in a formal report or whatever, and then translating it into something that's actionable within the organization. I feel like it's one of the hardest things to do for most organizations, because you've got to overlay your organizational priorities, and then your IT priorities, and then your security priorities, and then you've got now something that is going to change them, but you don't know if it's going to come after you. If one of the examples that I've seen in healthcare is you get this report that says there's a brand new zero-day attack out there that these crimeware groups are using to exploit organizations. And the hospital looks around and says, we've got 10-year-old vulnerabilities in our public-facing internet, like 0 days. So what? So how do you connect that, the threat intelligence, with an organization that maybe is dealing with an environment that doesn't have a very defensible infrastructure, where they have all these holes and they don't have the structures yet built to be able to act on the intelligence that they're getting?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'd, as always, look to Maggie and Jeff to chime in too. But I think that there is a role for threat intelligence, even in organizations who are like that, who are really worrying about just trying to prioritize upgrading from Windows XP or something like that, which I think is a reality in the ICS world. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that, even if threat intel is seen as sort of a more advanced thing, even if you have someone who just has that mindset, maybe they don't call themselves an intel analyst, but like you said, hey, we have something facing the internet. Something as simple as, like, if you have something facing the internet, here are the ports that adversaries like to use that we should probably lock down. I think something as simple as that is really threat intelligence. You're taking knowledge of adversaries and applying it to defenses. So that's my perspective from the IT side.
You just mentioned the title of a book before. It's funny, that just came by Amazon last week, because my CTI class that I took from SANS was one, like recommended reading, and so I've had some time in quarantine to catch up on my list of some other things. And the title of that book, intelligence-driven incident response, or an intelligence-driven security posture. When I was at the company before the ISAC, when they really bought into that and hired an intel teams, and started looking at prioritizing their defense activities based on what they think their exposure was. I think that that's more the right track. And you mentioned your friends at MITRE. We've been working quite a bit with them at the ISAC too. And a lot of that driven by demand from our members, like, hey, let's MITRE's a great resource for us. Why don't you guys help and put maybe your products in your intelligence bulletins and things like that, align that with MITRE. And a starting point would be, just Bo, you're just asking, kind of, if you could use the MITRE framework, whether it's the enterprise one or the ICS one, and say, okay, I'm in this vertical, and I know that this, if you look up on their groups, this group is known to target the electricity industry or the oil and gas industry or whatever it is, using these tactics and techniques. Well, at minimum, you could, I'm just thinking of one off the top of my head where there's 4, you could say, okay, well, we know that this dangerous group is after companies like mine, and they use these 4 at minimum. Well, pick one of them and say, okay, if you have a limited budget on where to invest cybersecurity resources or even physical resources, okay, let's look at this one and maybe do a walkthrough across the framework of, could I detect any of the activities that are described here in the framework? Where do I have a gap? And then you can maybe try to put, prioritize efforts towards addressing that gap, and then maybe move on to the next one. We've had tremendous success with just even, opening up dialogue between members, like this is all about sharing. There's a group of members that have kind of volunteered to share information with us and each other in a little bit of a project of looking at a walkthrough like that, and just saying, hey, I wonder if, are you folks are very similar to my organization. Maybe we have the same types of challenges. Can we, what did you do to address it? I don't know. We had, these folks do this, but just that dialogue, that sharing of real world challenges, because it's, the fix the OT problem is a very, very big, multifaceted, multi-headed beast. And there are limited resources, and folks need help. And you've got, ISACs, you've got MITRE, you've got the labs, you've got certainly solutions providers. There are so many resources out there, and just getting folks to talk about them and share information, conferences and SANS events and all kinds of things like that. Our GridSecCon that we have each year, getting people talking and sharing what they've done with this stuff. There are so many people that want to help, because it's a big problem.
And actually, just something I'd love to pick brain on in talking about the sharing and like probably the problems we're having, someone else is having those. I'd be interested in chatting a little bit with you as your perspective from the ISAC. Like, what do you think about formal versus informal sharing? Because I have a bias that the best intel that people have shared with me is like Maggie and I have wine at a conference and then we're friends. And then I'm like, hey, Maggie, have you seen this ICS threat? And she's like, yeah, I have. Here's the sweet, sweet intel. Versus like, Maggie, we are formally part of an ISAC now. And so we should share formally, indicators. Yeah, nice to meet you. We're going to share indicators for
anymore.
Threat intelligence. Oh, sorry, elbow tap, our bad. But it's a tough thing, and maybe we need both. But I've found sometimes informal can get people to open up a little bit. I'm curious your thoughts on that. Anyone?
So I think informal is great for security professional to security professional, and security professional to organizations that have the will and funds already to send people to events like that. But I also don't think we can rely on it because we're going to miss most of the industrial control sector in a pretty big way, unfortunately, which is kind of the just blunt and depressing reality of that. I mean, I completely agree with every point Katie just made. I mean, I know I think Beer ISAC's been called out already at least once today. But I mean, this is something that as an industry we do, and I think we do it super, super well. Me to Katie, me to Jeff, me to Bo, me to Bryson, or the folks over at Dracos. I think we've gotten really good at that, and I think we are going to continue to make traction widening that circle. But I definitely think in the meantime we need to embrace that circle isn't going to grow at a rate that's going to allow us to be holistic about it. So, how do we fill that gap with more formal, ISACs? And I think this is another point that I'd like to bring up, and this is probably more of a policy level point, is that the value of any, and you're going to have to excuse the formal intel background here, but I mean, the value of any intel is going to be driven by the collection. So realizing the collection framework is going to just inherently be very different for a ICS security vendor versus an ISAC versus CISA versus DHS. And so really encouraging our ICS partners and the ICS vendors that, when you're looking at threat intel, MITRE is awesome and CISA is awesome and the ISACs are awesome, but you really need to be looking at those holistically to get the most comprehensive picture to kind of inform your team.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, actually first, we're about 5 to 10 minutes away from questions, so get your questions in, and I will ask those live on the air as you watch the lovely panelists answer them, and squirm if they're too difficult. But when you think about all these different threat intelligence or information sharing apparatuses, what do each of them, what are the different values that you see? And you mentioned 3, I think, CERT, private sector vendors, and then ISACs. How do those differ in, either quality of what you get or the type of information or frequency? What are the benefits and why would you use one versus another?
I think we should let Jeff sing the praises of the ISAC first, and then we can hop in on it.
I agree.
Well, I mean, I think they're all different, and it depends. I really think, like Katie's answer earlier, it depends. But I think it's what you're after and what you want, because kind of continuing the answer to the last question about when you're sharing something informally, there are some organizations, and I think any ISAC is going to struggle with, getting folks to share. There's trust issues. There is, bandwidth issues, like Maggie just said. Might be one person that's responsible for security and uptime of a certain environment, and only has so much time. It's like the last thing I have time to do is send off an email or go, log into a portal and put a bulletin up. We get that. And then there are some that are driven purely by, we have to do this, where we have a responsibility to do this, or my boss says I have to do this. And so I just think it's just different depending on who has what bandwidth and what priorities. But and I also think there's different values in if you are sourcing a particular solutions provider for a particular type of information because you're laser focused on that for your organization, that could be very, very, very high value. There's some of the vendors that were mentioned earlier, solutions providers mentioned earlier. They're experts in certain things. So if you're responsible for a system that is similar to that, that's going to be very high value to you. I think that these community sharing and collaborative sharing models like an ISAC, they're tremendously valuable. I am a little biased, obviously, because of where I work, but I also was on the receiving side of that for 13 years. And there was some peace of mind and also some real eye-opening types of intelligence that was gleaned from knowing what your peer is dealing with, or knowing that somebody was seeing something. It was maybe an early warning indicator. So depending on which ISAC it is, you don't forget the government component to that. We are tied in with information from our government partners that is only they have, and a program like CRISP, that the information from a program like that is enriched by that source, and that's kind of one of a kind. So I think there's just, depending on where it's coming from and how many people contribute. And the one thing, if I could say anything today, it's please share more. Like, we need more information from the sector. No information is too little or just not useful to us, and we need it. And I would say that across any of these sectors, the more that contribute, the better we can give back, because we have a greater pool of information and data to bang against our sources and our resources to the smart folks that work there. The more that we have to pull from, the better work they can do and give back to you.
Good. Yeah, I think that's a fairly comprehensive answer. And also kind of pulling on I think it was Maggie that was saying this, but different organizations have different inputs, or maybe Jeff, you were talking about this. What are some of the most valuable inputs that you get? I mean, it's obviously impossible to rank them. All of your children are great, and you love them all equally, but of those, what are some of the most valuable inputs to get? And is there a different groups, like it's valuable to get private sector information to help other private sector, or government information to help private sector? How do you see that breaking down? And that's for anybody, and you can, Katie, for you, you can go wider than this and apply your knowledge of other industries to ICS.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think everyone has a different viewpoints, and we talk about this. Maggie touched on collection, and I know we dropped her, so I'm sure she'll come back. So I think that government is always going to have the advantage on certain things, like human intelligence, what sources say, or signals intelligence. That's just the way it is. And so, sometimes organizations like CISA might, through those sources and methods, have access to valuable intelligence for the rest of the community. Whereas, private companies, any vendors who have many customers, that's a pretty awesome data set, because you get a lot of different types of threats, a lot of different threat models, as we say, different types of targeting. And so I think each piece has their role, as Jeff said that, and Maggie said, CISA has a role, ISACs have a role. I think these informal sharing groups have a role as well. And there's a lot of different information. That's the other thing that I would encourage, those especially who aren't familiar with threat intelligence to think about, is that oftentimes people simplify threat intelligence to just sharing a bad email address automatically, as we talked about. And there's Maggie. Hey, Maggie.
Welcome back.
And it's so much more than that. As you asked, Bo, like maybe it's all the way from a strategic report on what APT 41 is very relevant today, what Chinese actors are doing, all the way down to very detailed information, maybe malicious indicators, as we call them, bad email addresses, IP addresses, or what a lot of people are looking at, especially with attack, more behavioral information, tactics, techniques, and procedures. How does an adversary jump from computer to computer? And so I think all of those things can be useful, maybe for different audiences, kind of as we talked about a little bit earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't give a better answer. You know, particularly, you know, folks that are touching, and this can again be from a member of the ISAC that's you know, has a network to defend, or like you just said, you know, some of the most, you know, targeted, really, you know, late breaking and quickly relevant information is the boots on the ground that we're doing an incident response, or, you know, going and fixing something, or doing a vulnerability assessment. They, you know, produce tremendous products about, you know, this particular situation, this particular event, this particular incident. So, you know, my folks really value that, because again, looking at then the information that's shared with us, it gives particular relevance to those certain things. But then again, you know, you don't have that information without the community collaboration, sharing the other side of it, and the government piece is just, like she just said, unique to them. So it's so hard. I can't prioritize which one is better. I need all of them to accomplish our mission and give good intelligence back to the sector. I have to have it all.
I also think it's important to remember, especially with private sector, that if you have, you know, any kind of pick your poison, any of the paid intel subscriptions, that those should not be viewed through the lens of this is everything that vendor is seeing, because so much of what, you know, their, you know, boots on the ground IR guys are just going to be so hand tied with NDAs. So, you know, between, you know, NDAs and classification stuff, just understanding that, you know, just like Jeff and Katie said, you know, a holistic view of all of these is going to be your best bet, but there are always going to be restrictions on kind of what you're seeing from an intelligence perspective. So, you know, going into it not expecting, you know, we love the salespeople, but sometimes salespeople can get a little creative, I think is a really good word for that. And, you know, I would just encourage anyone looking at a threat intel subscription. They're incredibly valuable, but don't go into that ever expecting that you are going to be seeing immediately in real time tactically everything their IR guards are seeing, because that's just a very unrealistic thing that I think sometimes gets a little misconstrued or lost in the noise of, you know, the hype versus kind of what you're going to see once you know, get into a subscription kind of situation.
All right, we're going to go to some audience questions here. First question is, Congress passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 to help improve information sharing across critical infrastructure sectors. Has that had an impact on information sharing? And if so, how? Everybody seems to be nodding their head. What do you think?
Good question. I don't have the data, I think, to make an assessment about that. Jeff, I probably look to you, or Maggie to you. As an analyst, I want evidence and data, and I don't personally have it. I don't think. It'd just be anecdotal.
Yeah, I'm with you on. I also don't have the data about that. I personally, you know, I have this conversation with friends who are in manufacturing engineering about, you know, kind of the posture of a lot of manufacturing facilities versus electric utilities is, you know, well, we don't particularly care as much because the government doesn't say we care. Like we don't have SIP for manufacturing yet. So I think anything where the government kind of starts to say like, hey, you care about this now, is always going to be useful in, you know, kind of motivating people to actually take a little bit more action, look at things a little bit more thoroughly, start implementing, you know, the best practices that are being encouraged. And it gives you a reason, because you can say like, hey, this isn't just me personally asking for information. Here's a government document saying that you should give this to me.
I don't have any definitive data on whether or not that directly contributed, but I mean, I've been at the ISAC. I just had my 3rd-year anniversary last week, and in the 3 years I've been there, you know, I have seen a noticeable increase in sharing with us. So from my, you know, limited perspective, it continues to go up. You know, we continue to build relationships and all the, you know, informal mechanisms that we talked about before. But I mean, it keeps getting more and more, and that also could be, indicative that, I have also seen a lot more information in the media, right, of all sorts about these types of threats. They've become more talked about in public, which certainly, stoke folks to take it more seriously, and certainly their executive probably saying, we have to do something about this. So the sharing has only been up since I've been there, and I'm sure that had a small part in it, but it keeps getting better, which is wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, anecdotally, I've seen that too. I always like hard data, which I don't think any of us have. It's hard to measure. But what I would say about CISA is, if I recall correctly, and probably a lot of the legislators and staffers on the call can correct me, but it's a lot of voluntary information sharing, right? Voluntary sharing with the government. And for anything that's voluntary, what I encourage anyone who's looking at legislation to think about is, why would I volunteer? Like, I hate to say it, but we have to be a little selfish as analysts or defenders. What's in it for me? If I share this information with DHS or with an ISAC or with anyone, I have to constantly be thinking about that sharing, as Jeff said, if it's one person who's doing security, it takes time away from what they're doing. And so what is the incentive to share? So I'd really encourage anyone looking at this kind of legislation to think about, especially when it's voluntary sharing, what incentives could you offer to try to increase that voluntary sharing? Maybe it's some sort of offer of, if you share this, you will get something else back. So it's something to think about there.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue to the next question, which looks like a follow-up. What could Congress do to improve companies' abilities to act on information sharing, especially smaller or less resourced ones?
So I'm going to be the bearer of bad news here, just because so much of my family works in smaller. It's 500 and under manufacturing. It's the sub-tier oil and gas, and it's not pleasant to say, but until there is some sort of, we all hate the dirty R word of regulation, but until there's some sort of regulation or financial incentive, I think one of the things that's really important to understand here is that, even for a small manufacturing shop, you're telling them that they have to have downtime for any reason security related because they might be taken down by a hack. That downtime you're causing them to have costs $10,000. If their line's down, it's down. I think if we really actually want to move the bar forward in a meaningful way, in ICS in general, we need to look at, for good or ill, people can look at it, but I think NERC SIP is a great example here of, steps that the government has taken to say, no, you care about this now. We say you care about this, and if you don't, there's some ramifications for that on the back end. And for smaller companies, I think that looks a lot more like some offline conversations that I had with Jeff, that, this is probably going to end up being more like an industrial safety model. That, I hate to use a cyber OSHA. But companies, large and small, have to abide by stuff like that. There was I forget what the conference was. There was a conference someone shared informally in our informal information sharing channel, that someone that made a quote about, cybersecurity in industrial control systems is like a seatbelt. You have to have it. And I thought that was so ironic, because you didn't used to have seatbelts. That wasn't something that was mandatory until we made it mandatory. And I know this is kind of a long-winded answer, but that's all to say that everything that we've done, whether it's seatbelts or industrial safety, hasn't happened because companies woke up one day and said, how we're going to spend our profit just willy-nilly on our own? I'm not going to get that Rolls Royce. I'm going to spend it on safety. Some of them might, but the vast majority of them weren't. A story that I personally love to tell is, OSHA be damned. My dad used to take me on well sites and shop floors, when I was 8 to 15 years old. No PPE, no steel-toed boots. And, that's kind of the most wholesome example we can use.
You turned out fine, Maggie. You turned out fine.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate that. No, I mean, that's kind of the most wholesome example that I can come up with for, companies shirking safety regulations. But we know companies shirk safety regulations, and if we know that, how can we possibly expect them to prioritize cybersecurity just on their own without, help from us in a pretty big way, and maybe, some carrot, some stick, or, combination thereof.
Yeah, I would just briefly jump in and, on Maggie's point of, regulation, I think that's a piece of it, the cyber seatbelt. I would offer Congress can fund things. There are government resources, for example, publicly disclosed that the FBI has a cyber action team that if private companies are struggling, they need help. This team can come in. DHS has things like that. NSA does as well. Private small companies who actually critical infrastructure, a lot of them can't respond to these massive incidents. So continuing to fund those things, I would say that would be on my wish list for any Congress staffers who are listening.
Right.
All right, we got another question in. What's been a most surprising or most effective information sharing you've noted in small to medium-sized companies? For instance, small infrastructure provider, power, water treatment manufacturer. In other words, what information can you bring us from the field? What's trickled up that you can share with others here on the call today?
It just takes one person to care. You can get one key person and that in that organization to really care about this. They'll make progress on their own. We don't always have to convince the entire organization. I've seen this happen in manufacturing and maritime specifically, where you take time to educate one of their engineers, and then all of a sudden, kind of through that exact informal information sharing we talked of, change starts to actually happen on the ground. People start not connecting things in ways that they shouldn't. Yeah, that's been the most surprising for me, is how little percentage of the organization you actually have to get to care for things to actually start happening.
Yeah. Any other stories from the field?
That's a fantastic answer. And then also one thing that was, eye-opening to me, going from, again, a very large company, and now that the ISAC, we interact with a lot of the smalls and munis and co-ops and stuff, that how some really are, a couple individuals responsible for all of this stuff, and how just overtaxed they are, and that they need help. But they're the ones that are, at these, whether it's a briefing or any of the myriad of things that are out there for people, like asking, like, hey, okay, what can you tell me today that I can take? Like, I got to start somewhere.
So they're wrapping up.
Okay.
And I would just briefly jump in as we start to close, because I see Bryson and his massive beard. As Maggie said, all it takes is a single person to care. I think that's why I love this field, because we can have an impact, and through sharing information, I think we can all have a chance to kind of get rid of these adversaries and make them have a bad day.
Yeah, we don't need Cyber Moses to actually part the seas for us. We can.
All right. Well, with that, we're closed, and I will hand it back over to Bryson.
All right. Thank you, Bo and company.